What's up, everybody? Welcome to Heresy Financial. My name is Joe Brown, and today we are talking about the fact that it looks like Janet Yellen, will be the next Treasury Secretary. So we're going to look at why it looks like that pick and that move looks like it's going to really institute a merger of sorts, or a de facto merger of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and then we're going to look at what that actually means and what that changes from the current setup that we have right now. Ready? Let's dive in. So if you are unfamiliar with who Janet Yellen is, she was the former Federal Reserve chairman before Jerome Powell. Very unpopular with people who know how money works and understood the negative consequences of everything that Yellen did. So what purpose would there be for Biden to choose Janet Yellen as a Treasury Secretary? Well, for a long time now, people like Ray Dalio have talked about the ineffectiveness of monetary policy over time. Well, back when the dot-com bubble burst, we had the first kind of Fed put where Alan Greenspan lowered interest rates to have the economy soften the blow of the stock market dropping, and that stimulated more purchasing, and specifically a lot of that new money from all that new lending went into housing purchases. And so people looked around and said, hey, during a stock market crash or a recession, the only thing that always goes up is houses. So there's a big flood of money going into houses. Obviously, we know how 2007, 8, 9 turned out. And instead of learning from their mistakes, they doubled down on what they did before, pumping more new easy money into the economy to try and soften the blow from the current recession that was happening at that time. Now, one distinction that we need to make here is the difference between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Now, the Treasury is in charge of what's called fiscal policy. So that's money coming in through taxes and borrowing, and then that's money going out through spending. The Federal Reserve is different. The Federal Reserve is in charge of monetary policy, and that's specifically through interest rates. So they raise and lower interest rates, and they try and stimulate monetary expansion by prompting banks to lend out. And so they lower rates, which is done in order to stimulate borrowing, to make more borrowing happen, because when more borrowing happens, then that's direct spending. And so the Federal Reserve is there to try and stimulate the economy through monetary policy. Now, the government, like I mentioned before, underneath the Treasury, they have two sources of income. That's either taxation or that's borrowing. Well, in the Great Financial Crisis, they needed to spend a lot more than they could take in from taxes. And so what they needed to do in order to spend as much as they wanted to was to borrow. But the problem is, who are they going to borrow from? Because they can't borrow from, American citizens and institutions, because big recession, big crash, the economy is already tapped out. They couldn't borrow as much as they wanted from investors around the world. And so if you need to borrow more, and who you're trying to borrow from is tapped out, well, the only, in a real economy, the only solution would be to borrow at much higher rates. Because if you can't borrow at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 for 5% interest, I'm sure there's some money out there that you could borrow from at 10, 20, 30%, right? At some point, that cost will be worth it to lend if you're getting a big enough return. The problem, though, is government was already tapped out. They couldn't afford to pay higher interest rates, because when you look at all the government spending combined, you're looking at the normal expenditures, but you're also looking at paying back the debt that they already have, which includes interest on that debt. And so they're not even getting enough income. And I'm talking 10 years ago, they weren't even getting enough income in order to pay off all of their expenses. They have to take on more debt to pay all of their expenses, plus the additional spending they want to do. So they have to borrow more in that case. Well, since you can't borrow at a higher interest rate and the economy's tapped out at the current interest rate, where are you going to borrow from? Enter in the money printer. So that's where the Federal Reserve comes in to take it up a notch, do something they hadn't done before, which is called debt monetization. This is why they called it quantitative easing, because they didn't want to call it debt monetization, because debt monetization is actually supposed to be illegal. When the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, they put big legal, red tape in place in order to prevent debt monetization from happening, because people knew if you have an entity that prints the money that's used in a country, there will be temptation by the government to spend as much of that money as possible through the use of borrowing from that money printer, basically. And so what they did was they said, hey, we need to put some barriers in place to prevent that from happening. So Federal Reserve, if you are going to purchase a treasury, buy a treasury, the only way you can do that is do it from the open market. You can't loan directly to the U.S. government. Otherwise, that turns into debt monetization, where essentially you're just a money printer for government spending. Now, they still follow follow that rule to the letter of the law, but they bypass it in spirit, because if you look at how much debt the Federal Reserve is purchasing, that is Treasury debt, basically all the new Treasury debt, all the new borrowing that the government is doing is financed directly or indirectly via the printing that the Federal Reserve has done. And so that was something new. That was why they called it quantitative easing, because they didn't want to give it the connotation that they were directly monetizing the debt, even though that's what they were doing. Now, both Bernanke and Yellen said, hey, at some point this is going to stop. They said at some point we're going to reverse this and we're going to start selling that debt into the economy, and we're going to wind down our balance sheet. This is just an emergency measure. Well, we know how that turned out. Back in 2018, they tried to start doing that, and it almost tanked the economy. So Powell reversed his steps, went back, and started expanding the balance sheet once again. Now, obviously, this year there was record amounts of spending, record amounts of debt expansion, record amounts of Federal Reserve balance sheet expansion, and the rate, the amounts, the magnitudes of those have dwarfed anything in the past. During the Great Financial Crisis, there were huge congressional debates about, $800 billion. That's nothing compared to the $3 trillion that they did this time. And this is part of the problem with taking the easy way out. This is part of the problem with neo-Keynesian economics, is that if you try and solve a problem by doing more of the same of what caused it in the first place, to try and just push it down the road, you need exponentially more of that solution as time goes on. So another $800 billion would have been nothing. It wouldn't have done anything. They needed $3 trillion this time. And next time there's one little trigger, one little catalyst that causes some of this pressure to bubble over or spring another leak somewhere in the system, which could happen any day, the solution will have to be more and more and more. $3 trillion will look like nothing compared to the next time it happens. And like I said earlier, this is why people like Ray Dalio have talked about the fact that you start to lose effectiveness from monetary policy by itself. And this is why all year long Jerome Powell has been saying monetary policy is tapped out. We need more fiscal policy. We need more spending by the government. Now, what prevents that is political gridlock, when you have Congress basically not agreeing on what to spend that money on, or how to spend it, or how much to spend it. And so it looks like right now, with the pick of Yellen as Treasury Secretary, it looks like they're trying to really merge. Whether it's going to be a legal merging of the two entities, probably not yet. That might come down the road, probably not yet. But what that looks like right now is, from a relationship standpoint and from a monetary view standpoint, where you agree on how spending should be done and what kind of things should be done between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, you're going to have really, really tight coordination there, more than we've ever had in the past. And you can have new lending programs established, new special purpose vehicles housed at the Treasury, funded by the Federal Reserve, to inject money, helicopter money or loans for certain specific types of spending to try and stimulate the economy. The tight coordination between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve just allows for much easier avenues to get money into the economy and sort of start to bypass the political gridlock. Now, most of what the Federal Reserve does today, I already mentioned the debt monetization, but other things like the fact that they fund special purpose vehicles housed at the Treasury, these are all things that technically skirt the laws and go above and beyond or around what Congress has allowed the Federal Reserve to do, but nobody's stopping them. And so as they continue to move further and further over the fence and further cross that line more and more, either one of two things is going to happen. Either Congress will do nothing about it because they like what's happening, or number two, they'll legally merge the two, and that could happen from some sort of catalyst where they need to bypass all of the red tape and all of the barriers between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, so that Congress just has full control of printing money, completely bypass the banking system to just get money where they want it. And that would probably coincide with the creation and the initial use of a new central bank digital currency, maybe something like a digital Treasury dollar instead of Federal Reserve notes. So I know I'm getting into the weeds a little bit on that, and that's a topic for another video, but suffice it to say that Yellen as Treasury Secretary will prompt a lot more tight coordination between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, which basically just means more and more and more money being spent by the government, funded by printing for any interest that the government wants to spend that money on. That will drive up asset prices, that will drive up consumer prices, and that will cause the value of your currency, of your dollars, to be worth less and less and less over time. How to protect yourself against this? buy gold, buy Bitcoin, buy paper assets like stocks, buy physical assets like real estate. Make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure you're hedged. If you don't know where to start, I have all my recommended sources in the description below. Now, last thing before we go, in my last video where I talked about how I just basically went all in on gold mining stocks, I really apologize. I got a ton of questions about how I hedged. I didn't explain my actual hedging method that I used to protect myself on a drop in miners just in case I'm wrong. And it was very simple. I just used puts, and I bought more puts than necessary to cover the actual shares that I have, and that's what I meant by I overhedged, or I hedged by 150%. That way, if the price of miners drops significantly, then the price increase in my puts, my put contracts, will more than make up for what I lost on those shares. Number one, and then number two, if the price of miners does what I expect it to, which goes up, then that will more than compensate for what I lose on the purchase of those puts. So that's why I said when the situation in where I would lose is where the price of the gold miners do nothing, because then I don't make any money on the miners, and I lose all the money that I spent on those hedges. And so that's why I said this is this over allocation to miners is a short-term play. This over allocation isn't something I'm planning on holding for years. I think miners will do extremely well over the next few years, potentially even the next decade. But when I said that this was a short-term play, I'm talking about my over allocation to it, that I expect a swift and aggressive move to start fairly soon here. So that's what I meant by that, and I apologize for not clarifying that in the actual video. So hopefully that clears things up for you. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Have a great day.